Hello everybody, and welcome to Total War Science. Today we're going to go into a deep dive on the mechanics of how direct damage spells work in Total Warhammer 3, as well as a few tips on how best to use them. Before we really get started, I've also made a text version of this guide that's linked in the description in case you'd rather read. To start, let's take a look at the spell tooltips and see what they can tell us. Direct damage spells are indicated by this little star icon and are labeled either direct damage or direct damage area. As the name suggests, these spells deal damage either to a single enemy unit or all enemy units in the area. Spirit Leech and Flock of Doom only do damage, but some of them have other effects like slows or vigor reduction. Unlike most magic, direct damage spells completely ignore armor, which makes them good against heavily armored elite units. They also don't affect friendly units at all, so you can drop AoE direct damage spells right on top of a melee battle, without worrying about hitting your own troops. They aren't as effective at wiping out clumped infantry compared to vortexes or explosions, but they can be a stronger option against cavalry, lords, and heroes. For example, we can see how these Chaos Knights and armored trolls are getting torn up by Katarin's overcasted Heart of Winter. Okay, so now that we've seen the spells in action, let's go ahead and get into the nitty-gritty details of how exactly direct damage spells work. We're going to go line by line and explain what everything on the tooltip here means. So first off, they're split into either single target or area spells up at the top here. Single target spells like Spirit Leech, you can just cast directly on your target and the spell will damage that unit for its full duration. Area spells cast a separate instance of the spell on every enemy unit in the effect radius, so you'll want to hit as many targets as possible with that AoE. The next line of spell tooltip is damage per second. So here we can see a minimum and maximum value shown for the damage per second, where the minimum is always going to be half of that maximum damage. So every time the spell deals damage, it'll hit for a random amount somewhere between the minimum and maximum value. And that means that there's some variation in how much damage the spell will do each time you use it, but you can just average the two numbers to get the average damage per second. So got some equations shown there where we can see that Spirit Leech will deal an average of 50 damage per second, and Flock of Doom will deal 93.5 average damage per second. Next up, we've got range and effect range. Range is just how far away from the target you can cast the spell, and effect range is the radius of the target circle for AoE spells. So pretty simple there. Next up, we've got the duration. This is just how long in seconds the effect lasts, both the damage and any secondary effects of the spell. Direct damage spells deal their DPS value one time immediately when they're cast, and then once per second over the duration of the spell. So you can get a quick estimate of the spell's total damage by adding 1 to the duration, and then multiplying that by the average DPS. So just some quick equations here. You can see we've taken the DPS values we calculated above, stuck them in here, multiplying them by the duration plus 1 to give an estimate of the total damage there. Then we can also see the cooldowns here. This is the delay after the spell ends before you can use it again. Because the cooldown timer doesn't start until the duration is over, spells with a longer duration effectively also have a longer cooldown. Add up the cooldown and duration to get the actual time between casts of the spell. And last but not least, we get to the green and red text at the bottom of these spells. The language CA uses here is unfortunately pretty inconsistent, but it's all different ways of telling us one important thing. When a direct damage spell actually deals its damage to a unit each second, it either deals all of that damage to one model, or it splits it between 25 models. Let's just go over that terminology real quick. A unit is one of the 20 slots in your army, so these cards down at the bottom here. A steam tank and an Empire Spearman, for example, are both one unit. Models or entities or combatants are all different ways to refer to the actual number of soldiers in the unit. So a steam tank is one unit with one model, while spearmen are one unit with 120 models / entities / combatants, whichever word you feel like using. So this is what most of that green and red text is referring to. Spells described as strong versus characters or strong versus single combatant hit one entity with each damage tick, while spells that say strong versus units with 25 or more entities or strong versus multiple combatants hit 25 models with each damage tick. Some area spells will also say weak versus single unit to remind you that you can and should hit multiple units with them when possible. If we go back to our previous examples, we see that Spirit Leech hits one entity for about 50 damage every second. So if we cast this on a Lord, Hero, or other single entity, the spell will hit that same target every single time, dealing a lot of damage. If we use Spirit Leech on a 120 mana infantry unit, the spell is going to pick one random entity to hit each second with its full damage tick. If it kills any entities, the high tick damage of the spell compared to the low HP per model of infantry means that some of that damage is going to get wasted on overkill. So here we can see that the Spirit Leech that was targeted on Ship's Company did 639 damage, while the one that targeted the Archmage did about 100 more damage than that. On the other hand, when Flock of Doom hits a unit, it actually deals 1/25th of the tooltip damage to each of the 25 entities. In the case of the Noblars, Flock of Doom deals an average of 3.75 damage to 25 different models with every tick. If there are more than 25 models in the unit, it'll randomly choose targets for every damage tick, effectively spreading the damage across the models. If there are less than 25 models in the unit, it'll still only deal 3.75 damage per tick to each entity, and any extra is wasted. So here we can see, looking at the Noblars, they've taken about 600-ish damage off their total health. Compare that to the Ogres, which have only taken around 300-ish, and the Tyrant here has taken almost none at all. So now that we've covered all the basics, here's a table with every direct damage spell in the normal spell lores, along with all the information we'll need to calculate their total damage per unit. So why is that final column on the right still empty then? Well, it turns out that due to a quirk of how units receive damage in Warhammer 3, the number of affected entities also factors into our damage equation. Spells can deal non-integer damage with each tick, but units can only receive damage as whole numbers. To resolve this, the game rounds all non-integer damage down to the nearest whole number. This means that randomized damage values, like those used by the direct damage spells, lose a small amount of damage on every tick due to rounding down. The exact number varies based on the spell's damage range, but it's always very close to minus 0.5 damage per tick. This is pretty insignificant for spells that only target one entity, since they only deal one tick of damage each second. On the other hand, spells that hit 25 entities are dealing 25 small ticks of damage each second, each of which loses some damage from rounding. So direct damage spells that affect multiple models lose about 12.5 damage per tick, which is roughly a 14% damage loss for most spells. So after taking all of that into account, we can finally calculate total damage for each spell. This equation might look a little scary, but it's just a combination of the three factors we already went over. On the left, we have the average damage per second of the spell. In the middle here, we've got the damage loss due to rounding. This number is either going to be 0.5 for spells that hit one entity or 12.5 for spells that hit 25. And then on the right, we've just got the duration plus 1, which will give us the total number of damage ticks. And that's it. Keep in mind that if the target has spell resistance or ward save, or if your caster has bonus spell mastery, then that'll change how much damage it ends up doing. So now we've got the total damage per unit of each spell filled in on the right there, assuming that you're casting it on appropriate targets, of course. One special case for calculating this is Heart of Winter, because it has 4 different damage phases, which functionally act the same as 4 separate spells being cast one after the other. So that means that in order to calculate total damage, you have to add +1 to the duration of each individual phase, or if you're using the averages, just add +4 to the total duration instead of +1 like with every other spell. Of course, total damage isn't the only thing important for these spells. Winds of Magic are, for most armies, a finite resource. So let's go ahead and take a look at how all these spells stack up in terms of damage efficiency too. Here we've got the total damage, Winds of Magic cost, and efficiency in terms of damage per winds for each spell. The left side of the table has values for normal casting, right there, while the right side has values for overcasted spells. I've ordered the table by damage efficiency when normal casting, since that's usually going to be more common. There are a couple trends we can see pretty quickly. For one, the most efficient direct damage spells all hit 25 entities per tick. That's not surprising because generally units with more entities have more total HP. Usually low-tier infantry are somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000-ish total HP, while lords and heroes usually only have a couple thousand health, at least until you get them leveled up and have them mounted on a dragon or something like that. We can consider this extra damage kind of a trade-off for reduced flexibility, since spells that hit 25 models per tick are nearly useless against single entities, while spells that only hit 1 model per tick lose some efficiency against multiple targets, but they can still do decent damage. We can also see that in cases where overcasting adds to the damage or duration components of the spell, then overcasting is usually, but not always, more magic efficient. Of course, overcasting has other downsides like miscasts or fewer passive triggers compared to normal casting, so you'll need to decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not it's better. Personally, in most cases, I usually stick to normal casting unless I see a golden opportunity where a high impact spell can change the tide of the battle with a single overcast. Of course, all this is just for the basic version of each spell. If your caster has relevant yellow line skills or other bonuses to cost reduction or spell mastery, then that's going to change all of the efficiency values shown here. Now that we fully understand the damage mechanics, the last mechanic that needs some explanation is how targeting works for AoE direct damage spells. Here's a list of all the AoE direct damage spells in the normal spell lores. Most of these spells can either be targeted on a unit or on the ground. The only exceptions are Tempest, which needs to be targeted on a flying unit, and Heart of Winter and Vengeance of Spirits, which can only be ground targeted. And then if you move over to the right column, you can see that most spells create an area effect for the duration that damages units that enter the area and will stop affecting units when they leave that area. Soul Stealer and Traderkin are different in that they hit whatever is in the targeting circle when the spell is cast, and they'll hit those targets for the full duration regardless of where they move afterwards, but they won't apply to units that enter the AoE after the spell has been cast. Let's look at a few examples of how the different kinds of targeting work. Flensing Ruin can be ground targeted or unit targeted. If we ground target, it'll create a stationary circle on the ground, shown by this blue circle here, and now we can see the effect of the spell lingering there. Once the ogre runs into the circle, he's going to start taking damage, shown by the indicator up here under his status, and he's going to keep taking damage as long as he stays within the range of the spell. But once he steps outside this circle here, as we can see, the damage of the spell is going to drop off. Now, you might have noticed that the duration under the ogre status showed the full duration of the spell even though it had already been on the ground for a few seconds by the time he got into the AoE. It'll always show the full duration of the spell up there, but the damage effect will drop off of all affected targets once the spell ends, regardless of how much time is left on that timer in their status bar up there. On the other hand, if we unit target Flensing Ruin, you can see that the targeting circle is going to follow these Gnoblars, and the spell goes off, and then you can see that even though this ogre wasn't in the AoE when it started casting, because he's walked into the circle, he's now taking damage. And if he leaves again, he will stop taking damage. Will he leave again? Yes, thank you for cooperating. So he stepped back outside of the circle, he's no longer taking damage because the effect is following the Gnoblars, who are moving again, and you can see that the effect is moving along with them. The other style of direct damage spell targeting only cares where the units are when the spell is cast. After that, it doesn't matter where they move. So for example, the Ogre Tyrant was in the AoE of that spell when it was cast, and so now he's going to take damage for the full duration even though he's left it. Meanwhile, the Gnoblars by now have entered the area where that spell was cast, but nothing has happened to them. And that does it for all the spell mechanics you need to know to make good use of direct damage spells. While this has been a mechanics deep dive, I will go over a few spell usage tips here to finish things off. For direct damage spells that only hit one entity per tick, the ideal targets are going to be lords, heroes, and squishy monsters with low model counts. Against tanky monsters like giants or mammoths, these spells just don't do enough damage to get great value. And against units with high model counts, you're going to lose some damage due to overkilling individual entities. The best targets for direct damage spells that hit 25 entities per tick are usually cavalry. Most cavalry have enough models to take full damage from these spells while also having a lower max HP compared to infantry. Cavalry are also faster and have larger models than infantry, which makes them less vulnerable to the other options you have, like vortexes, bombardments, and winds. Those types of spells will usually get better value against clumped infantry blobs than direct damage spells can. With that said, you can of course still use direct damage spells on suboptimal targets. Single entity spells can still do a decent job of finishing off low HP infantry, even if they are a little bit less efficient. And multiple entity spells, while they won't do much to a single lord or a hero, they can be helpful to burn down 16 or 12 model monstrous infantry or monstrous cavalry. Also remember that direct damage spells will never hurt your own units. You can drop in AoE right on top of a pitched melee battle to hit tons of enemies without worrying about friendly fire at all. Just remember to ground target the spell if you're doing that, to avoid a speedy enemy dragging it away from the rest of their friends. And last but not least, don't forget about the secondary effects on these spells. This guide has been focused on the mechanics of damage for these spells, but plenty of these spells can slow or cause rampage or increase cooldowns or other nasty side effects. For example, it might be worth using Melkoth's Miasma on a dragon, even though it does almost no damage, just to slow it down and give your missile units more time to shoot at it. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. This is my first attempt at a video like this, so please leave any suggestions or feedback in the comments. I plan to keep making more videos, probably with a focus on unit testing in Warhammer 3. I'm currently running a Monstrous Infantry Melee tournament, so that should be uploaded hopefully before too long. Thanks again and bye, y'all.